All right, let's set the scene. It's the summer of 1298, and we're about to witness one of the most pivotal clashes in Scottish history. In one corner, you have William Wallace, fresh off his incredible victory at Stirling Bridge, now the Guardian of Scotland. And in the other, King Edward I of England, the Hammer of the Scots. And he's back from France with a gigantic army and a serious score to settle. What's about to go down at Falkirk isn't just a battle. Oh no, it's a brutal collision of tactics, technology, and sheer will that is going to change the course of the war and seal the fate of a legend. I have brought you to the ring. Now dance if you can. Can you just feel the raw defiance in that? That's what William Wallace supposedly told his men right before the fighting started. This isn't just a speech. It's a challenge. He's saying, this is it, the main event. I've put you right in front of the enemy, now let's see you fight. He was betting everything on his men. So how in the world did we get to this point? To really get the stakes at Falkirk, you have to rewind just a little bit to the stunning, almost unbelievable victory that came right before it. After the Battle of Stirling Bridge, William Wallace wasn't just some rebel anymore. He was the Scottish resistance. What you've got to appreciate here is just how fast all of this happened. I mean, look at that timeline. In less than a year, Wallace goes from a relative unknown to the leader of a nation. His incredible win at Stirling, followed by these gutsy raids deep into England, made him an absolute hero. But, and this is the crucial part, his entire authority, his entire power was built on this idea that he couldn't be beaten. He had to keep winning. And that put him on a collision course with a king who simply could not and would not lose.
Yeah, here's the bottom line. Every victory for Wallace wasn't just a military loss for England, it was a personal slap in the face to King Edward I. And Edward was not the kind of king who just let things go. He saw Scotland as his property, a rebellious part of his kingdom. Wallace's success had to be answered, and not just with another army, but with absolute, overwhelming, crushing force.
And that, of course, brings us to the other major player in this drama. While Wallace was riding high, Edward was gathering his strength. He'd been busy campaigning over in France, but the second he heard about Stirling Bridge, he turned his full, undivided attention back to England with one single, ruthless goal in mind. You see, Edward wasn't just a king. He was a stone-cold general, methodical and absolutely relentless. He literally moved the entire English government to York just to be closer to the action. He was going to oversee this himself. This wasn't about politics anymore. This was personal. It was about erasing the shame of Stirling Bridge, and that meant one thing: destroying the man responsible, William Wallace. And just look at the kind of force he brought with him. We're talking about 15,000 men. Now, to put that into perspective, this was one of the biggest, most professional, most kitted-out armies England had ever marched north. This wasn't just an expedition to teach the Scots a lesson. This was an invasion force. It was designed for total annihilation. So let's do a little tale of the tape here, because the mismatch is just staggering. Wallace has maybe 6,000 men, most of them common foot soldiers with long spears. He has a small cavalry force, but here's the kicker. Their loyalty was shaky at best. A lot of those Scottish nobles had ties to England. On the other side, Edward has more than double the men, including 2,500 heavily armored knights. These guys are the medieval equivalent of tanks. But the real game changer, the one piece of tech that will decide everything, was the Welsh longbow. Okay, so Wallace is facing this absolute monster of an army. He knows he can't get lucky with a narrow bridge like he did at Stirling. He has to pick his ground, and his entire strategy is going to hinge on one very specific, very formidable defensive formation. It was called the Schiltron. The easiest way to picture it, think of a giant human hedgehog. You've got hundreds of men packed shoulder to shoulder in a tight circle, with a dense forest of 12-foot-long spears pointing out in every direction. Now, against the main weapon of the day, that terrifying charge of a heavy knight, a disciplined Schiltron was supposed to be unbreakable. It was a wall of sharp steel that no horse in its right mind would charge into. This was Wallace's answer to Edward's elite cavalry. So, on July 22nd, Wallace lays out his army. He creates 4 of these massive hedgehog formations on a slope, with some marshy ground in front of them to slow down the English. It's a purely defensive move. He's basically daring the English knights to come and break themselves on his spear points. But, and this is a huge but, unlike Stirling, where the terrain forced the enemy into a kill box, here he's out in the open. His army can't move, and that one decision is going to have absolutely fatal consequences. All right, so the pieces are on the board. The massive English army starts to advance. Edward's commanders are spoiling for a fight, and they convince him to attack immediately. And so the battle kicks off, not with some careful maneuver, but with the thunder of a full-blown English cavalry charge. The whole battle unfolds in 4 distinct, brutal phases. First, just like Wallace planned, the English knights charge and get completely stopped cold by that wall of spears. For a moment, it looks like it's working, but then, disaster. The Scottish cavalry, led by those nobles with questionable loyalty, they just turn and flee the field. That single act leaves Wallace's flanks wide open. The English knights regroup, sweep around the side, and just annihilate the unprotected Scottish archers. This is the turning point. Edward, who's a brilliant commander, sees his knights can't break the spearmen head-on, so he switches tactics and unleashes his secret weapon, the longbows. And that final phase, well, it's a massacre, as a combined attack finally shatters the Scottish ranks. And you have to imagine, for that brief moment, it really seemed like Wallace's insane gamble might actually pay off. Those schiltrons were magnificent. They stood like rocks against this tide of English steel. The chroniclers say over 100 of those incredibly expensive, highly trained war horses were skewered on the Scottish spears. The English cavalry was totally frustrated. They had to pull back. The Scottish spearmen had done their job perfectly. But this is where the whole thing just completely falls apart. The flight of the Scottish cavalry was an absolute catastrophe. All of a sudden, the schiltrons, Wallace's greatest strength, became his greatest weakness. They were stuck. They couldn't move, they were totally isolated, and they had no support whatsoever. They were, for all intents and purposes, just sitting ducks. Now, this slide right here gets to the absolute heart of the matter. You see, Edward didn't just have more archers, he had a revolutionary piece of military technology, the Welsh longbow. This thing was over 6 feet tall, made of yew wood, and it took incredible strength and years of constant practice to master. A good longbowman could fire 10 armor-piercing arrows a minute. 1,500 of them firing at once created a literal storm of steel that could punch right through chainmail from 200 yards away. The Scots had absolutely no answer to this. The descriptions from people who were there are just horrific. They said the sky literally went dark with arrows. The schiltrons, once a symbol of unbreakable strength, became a death trap. And that quote, like blossoms in an orchard when the fruit has ripened. Just think about that for a second. It's such a beautiful, haunting way to describe such a brutal reality. The men were just being cut down where they stood, unable to fight back, unable to move. So once those schiltrons were thinned out, weakened, and thrown into chaos by that endless rain of arrows, the English cavalry and infantry charged again. And this time, the forest of spears broke. The formations shattered, and the battle turned into an absolute slaughter. The aftermath, for Scotland, and for William Wallace personally, was just devastating. The numbers are just staggering. Thousands upon thousands of Scots were killed on that field, or were cut down as they tried to run. But the key takeaway here isn't just the sheer number of dead. It's the fact that the entire Scottish army basically ceased to exist after this battle. It was completely shattered as a fighting force. And the consequences just rippled outwards from there. For starters, William Wallace's military reputation ruined. The aura of invincibility he had after Stirling was gone. He resigned as Guardian of Scotland shortly after. The battle also put the devastating power of combined arms warfare on full display. That's using your archers to soften up the enemy before the knights and infantry move in for the kill. It was a lesson learned in blood. And maybe most important of all, Wallace's fall created a power vacuum, a vacuum that would eventually be filled by a new leader, Robert the Bruce. Wallace himself actually managed to escape the battlefield, but in many ways, his war was over. He'd continue to fight as a guerrilla leader for years, sure, but he would never again command the armies or the respect of the entire nation. The magic of Stirling Bridge had been broken, and his leadership just couldn't survive such a public, catastrophic failure. And this slide really shows you the long-term impact of this one battle. Falkirk wasn't just a win for Edward, it became the tactical blueprint for the English army for the next 100 years. This system, using longbows to destroy the enemy from a distance before the heavy troops move in, these are the exact tactics that would win England its most famous victories in the 100 Years' War at places like Crécy and Agincourt. It all started here. So that leaves us with a really fascinating question to think about. We always remember William Wallace for that incredible victory at Stirling Bridge. But is it possible that his greatest contribution to Scotland's freedom wasn't his win, but this devastating loss? Because the brutal lessons learned at Falkirk about the need for loyal nobles, for flexible tactics, and for an answer to that terrifying longbow, those were the very lessons that the next generation of Scottish leaders, and especially Robert the Bruce, would take to heart on their long road to finally winning it all at Bannockburn.